That's me scrolling past angry comments on videos about anything to do with digital audio, cables, and especially digital cables. I suspect I'll be doing a lot of that in the next week or so, because this is me testing the AA Audio SiG USB cable up against a few other excellent USB cables to tell you why the AA Audio SiG cable might be the very best cable that some of you can buy for your systems. Before we go too far, let's put the SiG cable into context. A 1 meter SiG cable from AA Audio will set you back around about $610 depending on exchange rates. If you just fainted at the idea of spending $600 or more on a USB cable, I'll give you a moment to recover while I show some soothing images to help calm the anger rising in a bunch of other viewers. Deep breaths, folks. Alright, back to the context. A curious evolved USB cable will cost you about $590 for a 1 meter cable. A tubulus Concentus USB costs about $610, exactly the same as the AA Audio SiG, and then a Ricable Invictus USB will cost about $675 for a 1 meter cable. So the AA Audio SiG is priced about the same as the competition here. And the first thing to note is that this is a lot of money to spend on a USB cable. And I don't recommend that anybody invest that sort of money into your USB cable unless you've already got the rest of your system organized, or if you're buying it knowing exactly what you're going to build around it. In other words, plugging a $600 USB cable into a $1,000 DAC or less than $1,000 DAC makes no sense at all. You'll get better results putting a generic USB cable into a $1,600 DAC. Spend the money on the components initially. However, if you already have a premium system or you're building towards it, and as I said, you know that your end goal is to get to that sort of level, then there's something very important that you need to know about USB cables. And it separates the AA Audio SiG cable from many of its competitors. Sometimes. Before we get to the most important feature of the SiG cable, let's talk a little bit about how it influences the sound of the system it's connected in, and why maybe the sound of it is not the most important aspect of the SiG cable's design. As I moved through various tracks to test all these different cables against the SiG cable, I found that the SiG cable delivered a slightly crisper and more forward sound than the Curious Evolved cable. That more forward sound can result in a slightly reduced sense of space compared to the Curious Evolved, and that's both in terms of the overall soundstage size and also the sense of space around each individual sound. But it's not to say that the SiG is congested or claustrophobic in any way. It's just a little bit more intimate and a little bit more immediate sounding. The sound from the Curious Evolved cable is a little bit smoother and a tiny bit weightier, and that can be a little bit more relaxing to listen to, but it could also be seen as lacking a tiny bit of clarity in the upper end. Which of these cables I preferred changed from moment to moment because they both have their strengths. And I think overall, as I spent more time across more tracks with both of these cables, it's the SiG cable that I lean towards ever so slightly. And it's just because I like that tiny bit of extra clarity and precision that it seems to bring to the sound. Swapping out the Curious Evolved cable for the Ricable Invictus served to further increase the sense of focus and precision in the soundstage. On top of that, it delivered even more clarity again to the sound. Once again though, the tighter focus resulted in a slightly smaller sense of soundstage size and space around instruments, and so you're trading one aspect of sound for another. And therefore you need to decide which is the most important for you, the sense of clarity and focus, or the sense of soundstage size and space. Ultimately though, both cables, or even all cables I could say, sound great, so there's really no wrong choice here. And to make matters slightly more confusing, it's also going to depend on which track you're listening to at which time as to which cable sounds better. And then of course there's also the question of system synergy. Which of these cables is going to work best with your current system or the system you're intending to build? Now if that all sounds vague and unhelpful, I've got something very concrete coming up shortly that might help you make a decision here. But we haven't quite finished talking about the sound of the cables, let's stick with that for just a moment longer. Changing tracks reinforced the fact that the Invictus cable does sound a bit closer and more intimate than the SiG cable. The Invictus clearly has a slight edge in terms of clarity, but the SiG cable delivers a slightly more open sound and was actually the slightly more enjoyable cable for me. I also felt like the Invictus ever so slightly subdued the sense of bass in the audio. It's only a very incremental shift, but I like my systems to have some body and warmth, and that's where the SiG gets a slight nod for me over the Invictus. Another change of track and another change of cable showed that the Tubulus Concentus USB, my current reference cable, delivers a slightly greater sense of space and soundstage size than the SiG cable, but there's a sense of greater immediacy from the SiG cable that's probably beneficial on a rhythmic track like Sky Mall. As I said earlier, preferences and track choice can play a huge part in which cable you prefer at which point in time. And so, how can you choose? If it's on aesthetics, the Invictus cable will probably run away with it, because in this group, it's clearly the nicest, finished looking and feeling cable. It's also perhaps the most unwieldy though, because it's thick and it doesn't like to turn corners. However, if you're like me and you don't care what the cables look like because they're hidden behind your system anyway, then how can you choose? Let me tell you. When you connect two devices with a USB cable, they complete a process that's known as a handshake. In electrical terms, it's sort of an exchange of voltage. Because of that, the impedance of the cable can matter, because changing the impedance of a circuit changes the balance of voltage and current carried through that circuit. In my experience with all the gear that I've ever tested, all of these cables work completely fine. But I do know that some gear is a little pickier than others, possibly particularly as you go into the higher end gear. At the recent StereoNet Melbourne Hi-Fi show, I was chatting to a channel viewer who was having difficulties with his streamer not recognizing his DAC when connected via USB. And we chatted about the fact that his current USB cable might actually be outside the correct USB specifications. What I mean by that is that USB cables are meant to be 90 ohms. Of course, there is a range of tolerance on either side of that figure, but if you stray too far outside of that range, there's a chance that the handshake process will fail and the upstream source device won't recognize the DAC. Over the course of my conversations with Anwar from AA Audio about the SiG and the previously reviewed SG cable, he told me that he's measured multiple audiophile cables and many of them sit outside the 90 ohm tolerance range. As an engineer, Anwar's focus with the SG and SiG cables was to design a cable that meets and sits within the USB specified 90 ohm tolerance range. And then of course to make sure that it also sounded great subjectively. And so where does all that leave us and how does it help you make your decision? Well, the AA Audio SiG cable is a premium audiophile quality USB cable that sits within the correct USB specification range. And that means you can buy it with confidence, knowing that it's going to work with even picky USB devices. What's more, if you have a super picky device that needs a precise 90 ohm USB cable, then Anwar also offers the SiG Reference cable, and those are the SiG models that sit precisely at 90 ohms. Those do cost significantly more, coming in at $870 for a 1 meter cable, but as I said, those are the rare specimens of cables that land exactly on 90 ohms. The rest of the SiG cables, the non-reference ones, they still sit within the acceptable tolerance range on either side of 90 ohms, but those reference ones are absolutely on the 90 ohm mark. And so do you have to spend extra on the reference version? Generally, no, I don't think so. Certainly if you have a picky transport, or if you just want the confidence of knowing that your audiophile USB cable meets the exact USB standard for 90 ohms, then grab yourself a reference cable. But my testing going back and forth between the regular SiG and the SiG reference cable suggested to me that there is no difference or such a small difference in sound quality that I really don't see the point in spending more, unless it's about the handshake process. And so there you have it. The AA Audio SiG cable is an outstanding performance cable from a subjective sound quality point of view that also meets USB specifications and won't leave you stranded with a failed handshake. As always, I've got a link in the description down below where you can jump through to the AA Audio website and check out the SiG for yourself. And if you want to see me, Anwar, and a few other audio reviewers, some of whom you might recognize, have lots and lots of fun trying to blind test USB cables, I've linked that video up here next. For now though, I want to say a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks here on YouTube on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.